Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. So we somehow figured out we can start. My name is Sidney Lu. I'm a social professor in Department of Transnational Asian Studies. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ron Zwigenberg. He is an associate professor at Penn State University. His research focuses on modern Japanese and European history, with a specialization in memory and intellectual history. He has taught and lectured in the United States, Europe, Israel, and Japan, published on issues of war memory, atomic energy, psychiatry, and survivor politics. Dr. Zwigenberg's first book, Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture, Cambridge University, 2014, is a winner of the 2016 Association for Asian Studies John Whitney Hall Book Prize. Deals comparatively with the commemoration and relocation of the Holocaust and atomic bombing of Hiroshima. His talk today is titled Survivors, Psychological Trauma and Memory Politics in Hiroshima and Auschwitz. I'll give the floor to Dr. Zwigenberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney, for your introduction. So hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for having me today. Today, I'm going to talk about, my talk today will be concentrating on the topic of my latest book, which will come out with University of Chicago Press next year, and which focus on the issue of trauma and PTSD, but actually it's a prehistory of trauma and PTSD. What I'm going to talk about today is what happened in Hiroshima and to a lesser extent in Holocaust cases before the advent of the concept we use today of trauma and post-traumatic stress syndrome. In a way, it's a prehistory that led to the creation of PTSD in 1980. This work is actually coming out to the first book that Sydney, as Professor Liu mentioned before, my Hiroshima book, which looked at the intersection of Hiroshima and Auschwitz through the prism of memory politics. What I looked at with the center of this book was a group of Hiroshima activists that went in 1961, 1962 to throughout Asia. This is a picture of them. Sorry, this doesn't work. No pointer, sorry. I'll just point my fingers. The picture here is of them in Israel, but also went to Poland and went back to Auschwitz. And my first book kind of centered it. And on this, and the center of the book was this year of 1962, which was when Eichmann was hanged. Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, was hanged, but also was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the year when issues of the Holocaust and issue of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was kind of brought together very forcefully within with the group journey, but also many other ways, like in the coverage of the Eichmann trial, which is the second caricature you're going to see here, which I'm going to talk about later on. It's a caricature from the Yomiuri Shimbun, from a Japanese newspaper, about the new Nazis, which are the nuclear powers. What you see them marching in with Nazi step here is basically the US, France, England, and the USSR. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. Now, my last book that I just finished also focused on 1962, and also, but it focused on a meeting which I wrote just briefly mentioned in my first book between a Jewish American psychiatrist, Robert Lifton, and a Japanese psychiatrist, psychologist, Kubo Shitoshi. Robert Lifton came to Hiroshima in 1962. Oh, sorry, I have two presentations to do, two computers, so apologies. So Lifton up here, Kubo Shitoshi there, they met in 1962. And what my book was, I was really kind of fascinated and also obsessed about this meeting was, what did they talk to each other? What did they say? I don't really know. I have only Lifton's account, which is also very fragmentary. He doesn't remember much. He's still alive, and I met with him a couple of times. And I found a couple of things he wrote about it in letters to friends, but I was really fascinated with this meeting of those two worlds. And what did they say to each other? How did they understand survivors' psychological hurt. And this basically, my book and research was aimed at understanding what led to this meeting and what led from this meeting. And throughout my research, I really focused on the problem of denial. Because what I understood that both in the Holocaust case and the Hiroshima case, there was no real concentration, no really understanding of the psychological hurt of the survivors in both cases. There was much more in the case of the Holocaust, I'm going to talk about it later on, but in Hiroshima up to very, very recently, and even to today, there's no real engagement with psychological hurt. And this is true both for the psychiatric and psychological community, but also for survivors themselves. And this is problem of denial, both as an ethical problem, but also as a historical, even philosophical problem, is what I'm going to focus on today. Today talk will have 4 parts. We're going to start talking very briefly, but very, very generally about what connects Hiroshima and Auschwitz as places and as simple. Then we're going to go up very briefly on the Holocaust case, focusing on Israel, then on the Hiroshima case, and then we're going to talk eventually what happened. And this is basically will lead us to 1962 in the meeting. And the last part, the postscript, will talk about what happened afterwards. What Lifton took from the meeting, how his work was dealt with in Japan, and the like. All right, so, oh, I forgot to put my start. So, the connection between Hiroshima and Auschwitz was made almost immediately. Well, not what Auschwitz, but the Holocaust. They didn't call it the Holocaust then, in this case, Buchenwald, but not by the victims, by the perpetrators. One of the first instances that I found was an American conversation about the morality and the impact of the bomb on and the impact of the bomb. And you can read those quotes fast, and I read it to you. You can see here 2 commentators. One of them is right-wing, Felix Morley. One of them is very leftist, Trotskyist, Dwight McDonald, when they say that we Americans should really think about ourselves. But what did the bomb made us? What we did is comparable to the Nazis. Yes or no? Now, this is a minority opinion. Most Americans, most commentators didn't talk about it like this, but this is very important. At least for me, it was important that you can see it as early as August 1945, because this connection was made almost immediately, and it continued to be made throughout the Cold War. But it wasn't really made in the context of Hiroshima until much later, and a lot got to do with the way that the way Hiroshima was commemorated in Japan, because Hiroshima was not freely commemorated. Hiroshima was under American occupation. So you have a case where people have to commemorate the tragedy. It was done. The perpetrators are the ones who are occupying you, right? It's also done in a context of a post-war Japan that sought itself a new identity. And one identity that post-Japan kind of flourished into, and specifically Hiroshima, is an identity of peace, of being the first and only country to be targeted by nuclear bombs. Hiroshima and Japan saw each other as unique. This is unique experience, and something will give them a unique role in life, a unique role in the world, which was under the threat of nuclear war. So this connection between the bomb and peace, which was made also by the Americans, the bomb ended the war, brought the peace, was something that elites in Hiroshima and Nagasaki kind of lurched into. This is the first anniversary of the bomb. You see here, the first one on the right. Here it come again. The first, the bright flash of peace, or one on the left is Amkudaro Heiwan, the requiem of peace that brought down from the sky, or dropped down from the sky. And the idea is that a bright flash, again, I don't have the pointer, I'm sorry, but it's in there in the center, you'll see that Hiroshima was a base of military that was transformed by the bomb. The baptism of fire basically washed the sins of Japanese militarism and led to a rebirth of Japan and Hiroshima as a place of peace. And this forward-looking, right, not talking about what happened, but talking about the peace and the future, was something you can see all over the political map, like either from the left, you see here from Japanese teacher unions in the image of the left, or in tourism, posters. You can see up here the atomic bomb is what people come to see in Hiroshima. The one over on the right, the doves coming out from the bomb, right? Or even the rose. Very, very forward-looking, not really talking about what happened, we're talking about the benefits, but a peace. This started to change in 1954 after the first H-bomb test, which caused upsurge, and the end of the occupation caused an upsurge in anti-nuclear feeling in Japan. And what you have there is that for the first time in Japan, you have the survivors coming out and being put in the center. Now, for various reasons I can go into later, I'm not going to get into now, Hiroshima, Japanese pacifism is very centered on victim narratives. So in the center, literally the center here are the babies. You can see here in the poster on the left, right? Like innocent victims, and also the people who are put on the stand, the first survivors that come up are women. And also in a very emotional way. It's a very gendered, very feminized idea of war memory, where women come up and say, war is bad, sensu wa ieda, and also to do it while crying, while nakinagara, all right? This is something, of course, genuine, right? I'm not saying it's not genuine, but the way it is framed, Japan as a victim, frame Hiroshima as a victim, which of course is obviously problematic to it. But what happened is, for the first time, you see another one, okay, women and children in the center. For the first time, you have the victim stories coming out. For the first 10 years, they didn't really come out. The focus was on this bigger narrative. Now, this very same thing, what I called in a book, emotional mobilization, right? The using of the emotional testimonies in order to mobilize the idea of witnessing, also happened in Jerusalem with the Eichmann trial, where David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor in the trial, put victims of the Holocaust on a trial, when also they gave very tearful, very emotional testimonies. And it was used to galvanize the youth. It was aimed at galvanizing the youth and teaching them about the Holocaust, and in mobilizing the community in a name of memory. This, of course, lead eventually to the rise of survivors and witness. So it is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, in both Hiroshima and Israel, moving to Israel now, okay, the first 10 years, survivors were not at the center of commemoration. In both places, there's not much talk about survivors as bearers of memory, the way we understand them today. Actually, there was a lot of stigma on being a survivor in both places. And even more so when it comes to people who were mentally hurt by the Holocaust. So in 1951, for example, there is a rumor in Israel about a ship of 1,000 mentally sick patients that are coming from the DP camps, displaced person camps in Germany, supposedly coming to Israel. Never happened, but there was a rumor circulating, a lot of anxiety about this. And if you look at the files of the psychiatrists that dealt with those people, both in the DP camps and in Israel, you see a lot of the same kind of denial that you can see in the Hiroshima case. It's not everybody, of course, but there is kind of an agreement you can see between the patients and the doctors, not to really talk about what happened, but what will happen from now on. So Fisher Schnorrison, for example, see here on the right, who worked in Israel and in Cyprus, talked about how victims are immunized from trauma in the healthy environment of Israel. Healthy environment of Israel will transform the victims. And here in Israel, we don't have as many mentally hurt people as we have them in the diaspora. This is not everybody. Like Leo Sroll, for example, who worked in a military, another psychiatrist worked in military, who was a military psychiatrist, so a lot of connection between veterans and shell shock victims. This is World War I term, and survivors, but he was a lone voice. He was minority. Even more than Israeli doctors, German doctors that were working for the compensation reparation mechanism. So mental hurt was acknowledged by the reparation mechanism in the agreement between Israel and Germany. But the people who had to do the evaluation were German doctors. And Dagmar Herzog and other German historians shown that those doctors a lot of time were anti-Semitic, very hostile to victims. And they continuously and intentionally denied care and denied compensation reparations for Holocaust victims. So in one quote that I have here, talking about psychic male development of this Mr. H, a person who was in Auschwitz and in other camps, what the German doctors were claiming is that there's no causal connection, right? You cannot prove that male development, maladies, whatever they have now is connected to the Holocaust, maybe something else. They claim themselves to be objective, that there's no objective connection. If you want to be scientific, you want to really prove that there is a connection, you can't do it. It's because of the nature of trauma. But for the German doctors, they use this, they use Freudian ideas that all German trauma, also all trauma comes from the childhood, and so on and so on. Now, in reaction to this, you have a whole movement of American and Jewish, Israeli, and German doctors as well. We should mention this, they're German doctors as well, who, as the survivors are gaining in importance and getting in stature, are using survivor experience to counter the German doctors and to have a campaign for acknowledgement of mental hurt. And this is the start of what will eventually become PTSD. This is one of the main avenues that lead eventually to PTSD. Now, very importantly, the language they use is the same language that is used in memory politics, in memory advocation, by memory advocates, memory agents, as you call it. So you see here, for example, American Dr. Paul Chodov talk about the Holocaust survivors as the Lamentov, the 36 just men, righteous people, right? So the survivors have almost a religious-like plague, and you cannot deny those people compensation. You cannot deny those people acknowledgement. Very, very similar language used by Elie Wiesel when he talked about survivors, almost triumphant, right? This movement from shame to pride. When you see it here, and again, all those quotes, I'm not going to read to you, you can read it. You can see how the universalization of the Holocaust experience, the importance of the Holocaust experience, but most important for me, sorry, no pointer, messianic dimension, right? The Jew will save us from a new Auschwitz, and a new Auschwitz is nuclear, Hiroshima. This is 1960s, right? This is how they understand the new Holocaust, to be a nuclear Holocaust. Very, very similar language here. Hidankyo is the survivor organization. They talk about Golgotha, about Hibakusha as being the Christ of humanity. Very similar language. But if this language in the case of the Holocaust led to acknowledgement, reparation, compensation, it had almost the opposite effect in Japan. Why? Let's move to Japan. I'm so used to teaching, I thought I'm like stopping and asking for questions. I haven't done it in so long, like standing in front of a room. I mean, for 2 years, we used to do it in Zoom. So, all right. So we're moving to Japan now. So if you look at denial of PTSD, well, not PTSD, I'm not going to use the word, denial of psychiatric hurt in Hiroshima, you see a mixture of things. Some of them are very, very similar to what we saw in the Holocaust case. So for example, with the ABCC, the American Atomic Bomb Casualty Committee is an American research center. It was in Hiroshima. Actually, their archives are right here at Rice in a medical center. I don't know if you know, but they are the most important medical facility, most advanced medical facility that was set up by the American government in order to study the survivors, the Hibakusha, in order to learn what we can to prevent this thing in a case of a nuclear attack on the US, which was seen imminent in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, this was dominated by medical doctors. They cared very little for psychiatric and psychological issues. And also, it had, as Susan Lidney and other people have shown, have a tendency to deny long-term impact, long-term effect of the bomb, and to deny which also responsibility, need for compensation, reparation, all those things, right? And you can see here when they talk about psychiatry, for example, this is a letter from one of the directors, one of the doctors, basically trying not to deal with this. And the strategy they're using is very similar to the German doctors, denying causation. Whatever happened in 1945 had very little to do with what happens now. right? Why? Because we are objective. They suggest that there are critics, in this case, Shimizu Kyoshi, a sociologist that criticized the ABCC for not acknowledging mental hurt. They claim it, their critics, to be very subjective, very emotional. This exact same language that German doctors are using to talk about the Jewish doctors and others. We're the objective ones. You're subjective. You're emotional. Well, Guillaume Bibi is a physician with the ABCC, right? Also, very interestingly, when they deal with Robert Lifton, who also criticized them, they present themselves as the one who really care about the survivors. And this is because they see mental hurt as some kind of a stigma. And if we talk about a mental hurt, we basically stigmatize the survivors. So they present themselves as the true protectors of the survivors. Very interestingly, the people who support the survivor organization have a very similar position towards the survivors. Just keep it in mind as we're going to talk about them in a couple of minutes. Okay. So now, mental hurt, psychiatric hurt, trauma in Japan as a whole has a very problematic history. So why the Americans wouldn't acknowledge this? The American agent, the US government never acknowledged responsibility, moral or otherwise. We cannot stand this. But why do the Japanese doctors don't acknowledge this? And this got a lot to do with the history of trauma and history of mental hurt in Japan. Now, there's a very, very long history to this, but I will focus only in the last 15 years before the bomb, very, very briefly. And the emphasis in Japan and Japanese military, because all those people who were doing it were doctors during the war. Almost every single person I talked about so far was a military doctor, right? So if you look at military doctors in Japan, right, during the war, there's an emphasis in Japanese war fighting on Yamato Damashi, or, sorry, it's missing either, Japanese spirit. The Japanese army really emphasized fighting spirit, and they saw themselves as very similar to the Zionists, as something like almost immunized from, because of the high morale, from trauma and shell shock. This is something that happened to the weak Westerners. We Japanese have a unique ability to deal with this. The German army uses very, very similar, the Nazi, the Wehrmacht, use very, very similar language and deny that, to deny any kind of trauma to its soldiers. It's something that happened to weak Americans, not to us, right? Another thing and connection between Germany and Japan, because all those people were educated in German psychiatry, that there is this suspicion of trauma as something that's connected more to obsession with being compensated than with actually what happened during the war. So both German doctors and Japanese doctors talk about like pension neurotics. So Retten Neurotiker or like Hosho Shinkeisho, very, very similar language. So the patients will be obsessed with getting money rather than so it's about the now, not about what happened during the war, right? So just look at a couple of case studies. So I have one chapter on this guy, Kuno Masa, who is again a German, was a German-trained military psychiatrist during the war. And what you see in his studies, is not quite the same as wartime denial of trauma, but an emphasis on biological causes to whatever trauma people had. He did a lot of research on veterans of the Sino-Japanese War, both the first one. I mean, he claims, we don't really know because a lot of it's going over censorship, both American and Japanese. But probably the second one, like from the 1930s, right? And what he claims in his research is very, very similar to what you have in German psychiatry on veterans of the Wehrmacht, is that the reasons for psychological hurt are not psychological shock, but problems with nutrition, shell shock symptoms, so head injury. Everything that he looks at end up being physiological. And this is because he's looking for him, physiological, biological reasons are seen as superior explanation to the psychological than simply psychogenic explanations. Those are not seen as sufficient. It's because you can't really prove it. What do you want? Something you can really prove with blood samples, with nervous system damage, something you can actually show. And again, it goes back to those and don't really look at the psychological issues. Now, both with him and with other doctors, unlike in a Jewish case, there's no organizational effort, there's no compensation. So this means there is no incentive to also organize. There's no incentive to come forward and look at those cases, because he and a couple of others are really alone in this, and they don't really talk to each other too much. But he is really unique in looking at this case of what's called, and keep looking and really hounding, and again, going back to this throughout the 60s. And one important thing that he looks at is called Bura Bura Bio, or A-bomb fatigue syndrome, that survivors keep telling doctors they're tired, they don't have any energy, they're depressed, they can't go to work. Now, for society at the time, survivors seem as basically lazy. But he say they're not lazy. They have psychological, they have psychogenic, they have biological issue. There's something that to do with radiation. Now, it's very important, radiation here, because people don't know what is the real effect of radiation. They don't know what radiation does to the human body or the human mind, and they don't have the tools, it's the technological technology to deal with this. So this, and again, this and also the emphasis on biology basically lead him, you see here in the last quote here in 1960, to almost get into what we now will see as trauma, but say we can't conclude this. He always stop a little bit before he gets to, okay, it's trauma, right? And again, there's not as no research on trauma out there. It's not he's not aware of it. He does cite people, he knows the literature, but he never really concluded this is what we now understand as trauma. We look at psychologists like Kobayashi Toshi, the guy who met Lifton. We have a similar, and he's a psychologist, so he does look at psychological shock and not in biological somatic issues, but he also looked for scientific methods. He looked for commonalities. He looked for objectivity. And this is very interesting. The way he looked at trauma is not as something that actually make the victim an unreliable witness, and make work on it dangerous because it's not scientific, you know. He wants to generalize. And this is very different from how we look at trauma today. We look at trauma today, PTSD, as something give us some kind of an insight, a truth into what actually happened. The idea of flashback, right? Which we get from the movies, it's like we understand exactly what happened because it was supposedly frozen and coming back to us. But he sees it as something actually goes against objectivity, truth, and the like. So he really tries as much as possible to get to some kind of objective commonalities, which lead eventually, again, to lack of ability to see, to deny trauma. Again, not because he doesn't think they have mental issues, but because he can't see it as something particularly, as something which is leading directly from the bomb to now something you can actually generalize about. Now, very importantly, Kobayashi Toshi was very aware on Holocaust work. He was part of a working group, actually, a Japanese psychology organization, association working group on Holocaust work. And in the case of Holocaust, unlike the case of Hiroshima, there is growing acknowledgement of the hurt and mental harm done in the camps. But when you look at how Japanese psychologists used and what they care about when they look at those works, like, for example, if in the work of Bruton Bettelheim, what they care about is not the mental hurt, but about issues of authoritarianism, yeah. Sorry, non-native speaker, so sometimes get it. What they care about is what lead people to obey the Nazis. So, for example, in this work here by Shimizu Ikitaro, who review Bettelheim work, he cares about the making of a totalitarian personality, or either authoritarian personality or being subject to how the Gestapo broke people, right? You see here also in the work of Kido Kotaro, another psychologist. What happened to the individual when he's exposed to oppression? How can they lose their subjectivity, right? How prisoners get a spirit of obedience. And very importantly, they connected directly to the question of why Japanese became fascists, right? This is what they care about, totalitarianism. They care about totalitarianism, they care about the lack of subjectivity, they care about the breakdown of democracy. And they're not reading Bettelheim wrong, because, and this is from a review, Bruno Bettelheim, of Hannah Arendt work on Eichmann, right? Bruno Bettelheim as well cared about this. They cared about totalitarianism rather than about what we care about when we think about psychology now, right? Bruno Bettelheim, in a completely different context, right, cared less about anti-Semitism, but totalitarianism, right? And you can see it also generally in Japan in the way they look at the Eichmann trial, right? Like going a bit away from psychology here. Okay. How am I doing with time? Sorry. Because okay. Okay, so I have another 10 minutes or so. Bear with me. Okay. So if you look at the Eichmann trial in Japan, what you see is that what people care about, again, is the issue of totalitarianism and cross-cultural values and stuff like this. They care about the stuff people in Japan care about. They read the trial in very, very differently than we in the West do, right? So, for example, this editor from Yomiuri Shimbun talks about the trial as a chance for Westernism to think about cruelty of Western culture versus like supposed cruelty of quote unquote Oriental cultures, right? They also see themselves as being better than the Jews, right? Because the Jews want to kill Eichmann, eye for an eye, while the Japanese supposedly forgave the American, right? Or here, the issue of totalitarianism, and come back again, right? Editor of Mainichi Shimbun here, see Eichmann like fascism and dictatorship, right? Takayama Michio, who is the author of The Harp of Burma, is a very famous anti-war novel, talk about the Khrushchev speech and the issue of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union, and again, kind of bring together both anti-communism, anti-fascism, and again, going back to the issue of totalitarianism and connection to the Japanese as victims of World War II and victims of totalitarianism. And you can see it very clearly, I guess, in this caricature I start with, when the nuclear powers are seen as the new Nazis. The implication here is that the Jews also and the Japanese are completely equal, right? Of course, the Japanese are not equal, or they're also victimizers, but all of this is kind of going away in this equation. So this is where we stand in 1962. And this is where very, very different places that Robert Lifton and Kobayashi Toshi came from. If Kobayashi Toshi came from a world where the issue of totalitarianism was in the front, where it was very hard to talk about objective connections between what happened in the bomb and what happened to survivors now. Robert Lifton came from a world, he was a Jewish American psychiatrist. He was very involved in the same circles that advocated for survivors. And he was very aware of Holocaust survivors. And the connection he made was not between perpetrators, but between victims. And he really focused on commonalities. What he was seeking to evaluate is from a letter that he wrote at the time, to what degree exposure to atomic bomb in Hiroshima resembles psychological and social patterns common to all disasters. What he's after here is universalization, and after the universal figure of the survivor. Up until now, we talk about victims, but what he cares about is survivors, how people overcome, or what people, not about the experience at the time, but how people may overcome, or how they live with how they live with trauma, with disaster within them. That's why he called it Death in Life. That's his famous book, came in 1968, because survivors always have death within them. Became very controversial in Japan afterwards. What he see in all those places is the issue of psychic closure, of numbing, of mental hurt that you see in all, the effect of mental health you see in all disasters, right? And he look at the survivors of Hiroshima and Holocaust as, you see a model in both places to way to overcome, but also live with this. And he said how he is inspired by the way those people handle this. But he doesn't really talk about them as messianic, but in a very normal way. Very different from Wiesel and other ways, like people who just learn to live with this. And when you come and take this, come back to the US and bring this research with him, he also worked with Vietnam War veterans. He's getting in touch with people who work on domestic violence issues. Is there like the beginning of second wave feminism? There's all those people coming together, and in Detroit in 1968, in the Conference on Massive Psychic Trauma, Henry Christel is a guy who worked on Holocaust survivors, talks about how, for the first time, you see a universalization of the phenomena. When you look at the Nazi persecution, you look at Hiroshima, you look at other places, you see survivor guilt, you see identification with death, and other things that show about universal category. This is the road that will lead to PTSD, right? And this is coming from Lifton commitment to anti-nuclear politics and seeing Hiroshima and Holocaust as a threat to human future and also to human nature, to very humanity of those people. And in his work and other people's work, again, you see coming together of all those different places, all those different narratives. Now, Lifton work comes out in 1968, it translated to Japanese in 1971, but it doesn't have much traction. The reason is his research is seen as being denigrating to the survivors. And also because he's seen as just another white man who come into the East and tell them how to deal with their own problems, right? It's not accepted very well. So Ishida Tadashi, a sociologist that very important in work. This is a book over there. The thinking or the thought of the atomic bomb experience. He said that it was a shock for him that American could have such a study before us, but how he explained this is through the experience of Auschwitz, right? And he also inspired by this to use it in order to develop his own methodology, which he developed in this book, like anti-bomb, Hangenbaku, which he connect to Lifton, but also to his reading of Viktor Frankl, Man in Search of Meaning, in which he focused on a quote by Spinoza that talks about how we can think objectively about suffering. That if you raise yourself above suffering and above emotion, suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture, objective picture of it. And what he's after here is, again, objectivity. It's very, very different from what Lifton and other people are looking at. He wants objective way. He want to do what Kobayashi Toshi wanted to do from the point of view of the scientist. He wants the survivors to be the objective ones, right? He wants a survivor to be able to objectively evaluate what they've been through and move from suffering to surviving, overcoming suffering. He wants a subject can overcome the suffering. The emphasis is overcoming, and the overcoming is done through objective reflection and through political work, through coming out and telling your story. The flip side of it, however, is that people who cannot do it are seen as drifters, people who don't come out politically, people who don't come and speak publicly are seen as people who succumb to the bomb, succumb to the spiritual death of the bomb, who don't do ideological work, right? very important. He spoke about ideological work here. Okay. And this have impact up until today, even though PTSD is acknowledged in Japan since the 90s, even though there are already categories of compensation and treatment of categories. When psychiatrists in Nagasaki tried to introduce the idea of Hibaku Taiken, the experience of the bomb, as a category for compensation, it was rejected by survivor groups because the survivors that were only get recognition as Hibaku Taiken as a bomb experience, right? Only psychological, rejected and say, no, we are survivors, period. So it's, yeah.
So when you say that's not a distinction from production.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, no physical. Yeah.
Maybe remotely living near Hiroshima.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So all right. So backtrack a bit. All right. Thank you very much. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the model of compensation is based on concentric circles. Okay. The more compensation and more treatment you're going to get, the closer you are to the bomb, the more to the epicenter, the more money compensation you're going to get, right? People who are outside this arbitrary, I think it's 2 kilometers in Hiroshima, is a little bit more in Nagasaki because of topography, did not get compensation until very recently. In order to counter it, they were offered, people who were not included, offered the idea of you can be a bomb experienced person. But they rejected it. They said, we're not a bomb experienced. We don't just have PTSD. PTSD is not enough of a category. It's not valid enough a hurt. What we are actually also victim of radiation. We're also victim of the bomb, which implies that they're not real victims, only with PTSD. There's a rejection of PTSD. PTSD is a valid category of hurt, which really leads us to the issue of denial, back to where we started from, because denial can be seen in many ways, right? It can seem like as an actual denial of the hurt, like you see in the case of ABCC and or an inability to see the issue. And I think in this case, the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the inability to see, inability to acknowledge, inability to interpret this as what we see now as PTSD is what we see here, right? Because the victims themselves don't recognize, don't experience this as PTSD. The problem is that we in the West take the category of PTSD and just project it outward into other cultures, also across time. And we can't do that, right? Because the victim themselves, in this case, don't see their suffering as psychological. And maybe it's not just psychological, we don't really know, right? But we really need to think about how valid are categories beyond the West, specifically here in Japan, but also in other places. They're not in other places. PTSD did a lot of really good work in acknowledging victims in various places. A lot of people benefited greatly from that, but maybe not in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when it can be used, as the survivors here are claiming, to deny their suffering rather than acknowledging them. And the problem is, and this is where I want to end with, is that we don't really listen to the survivors eventually. Not everybody want to talk about it. Not everybody want to come out and witness. Not everybody want to go to psychiatrists and bring it up again. This is a very Western idea of how to deal with psychiatric hurt. And I want to end here with this quote by Anonymous Baksha, 1962, which talks about how they actually choose not to talk. They choose to remain silent. ABAM victims don't want to speak out. He said he detests those who fail to appreciate our feeling about silence. We cannot celebrate 6 August. We can only let it pass away with the dead. Thank you. All right.
Okay, thank you. We have plenty of time for Q&A. Just want to let you know that we also have people to join us through Zoom. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. For those of you who are joining us, you can type your questions here so that our speaker can see it and pick up a question and answer it. I will give the floor to our speaker. Any questions? Feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah.
Sorry if this is sounding like it's not my period or my region.
Yeah.
But I'm fascinated by your earlier description of the Japanese presentation on Hiroshima being something that brought peace and then economically doves, roses. And I'm wondering if you're suggesting that the agony of this traumatic experience could have maybe not the immediate victims, but cultural identity to emerge. That this is an expiation of sin, that they can be victims in this earlier discourse, like the Jews of World War II, because they shut this extraordinary event and it erases somehow responsibility for their role.
Yeah, it's not, well, first of all, I mean, as someone who deals with Holocaust and Hiroshima, similarities, of course, I look for those things. They're not as prevalent as we think about it now, because now, even in Japan, everybody knows about the Holocaust. 1940s and 50s, up to the Eichmann trial, this is why I focus on 1962 so much. Even in the West, people didn't talk about it so much. Actually, what I claim in my first book, that Hiroshima was much more publicly visible in Hiroshima survivors, publicly visible than Holocaust survivors. It wasn't even called the Holocaust until arguably the 70s, the 1978 Holocaust TV series with Meryl Streep and who else? There's a whole bunch of people there, right? Was arguably what brought the Shoah, the Holocaust, into the public sphere. So kind of like victims like the Jews is something that happens only post Eichmann trial and also in particular case. But the fact of them talking about themselves as victim was something that, yeah, had the implied benefit. Now, in 1968, the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War movement focused on this and challenged the older peace movement and focused on Japanese victimization. I mean, I showed here very particular trajectory, but of course, it's much more complicated than this. But in the beginning, there is almost a perfect alignment of like Japanese elites and American elites that don't want to talk about what Japan did in Asia. It focuses on like Pacific War and reconciliation between Japan and America, and it focuses on the bomb. Ironically, lead to this kind of narrative, because both in the American narrative and Japanese narrative, the bomb brought peace. I mean, I can talk a lot more about it, but basically that's what happened. And the connection to the Jews only came later, I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate that your talk is actually some very hard to be aligned with issues. There's very intelligent issues.
Yeah.
For example, transition justice.
Yeah.
And all Koreans or Koreans because of the colonization that they suffered from Japanese? Or how about all Japanese, shouldn't all Japanese blame China because of the war that they have to go through? Now, of course, after the war,
Yeah.
Japanese, it's kind of found from public discourse that we feel so down here. Right?
Yeah.
All Japanese people must apologize.
Yeah.
But some would say, no, I didn't want to. It was emperor.
Yeah.
Emperor lives. He's not facing any justice, right? Why should we apologize? It's all very kind of complicated. So,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying you're talking medicalizing issues. I think medicalization is a value.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also see the time. Nobody would claim that Auschwitz victims is others.
Yeah.
part of any.
Yeah.
any oppressive force. No.
Yeah.
However, Japanese may receive differently.
Yeah.
Especially from Americans who claim that Pacific War was a just war.
Yeah.
So how would you reconcile?
Well, actually, my whole talk, the whole book was about the issue of medicalization of trauma and the use of medical language, which is focused on individuals and applying it to all communities. I'm very much against this because communities are not individuals. It's almost like a fascist organic idea of like a community, right? I mean, are we all traumatized? What is a collective trauma? I mean, to what extent can we talk about collective trauma, and how much of it? What's the parallels between what happened to the body and the mind of an individual and a community? I think it's much more complicated, and I think we all can agree with the community is much more complicated, and it'll be too easy to medicalize it. The way that, and in my book, I break a whole bunch of examples of people who do that. We use trauma studies, a very specific, very simple way to say the Korean people are traumatized, the Japanese people are traumatized, individuals are traumatized, communities go through. You can talk about the language of chosen trauma. There's some kind of, I mean, there's all sorts of ways to talk about it in a more sophisticated way, but I really don't want to medicalize it. And you're right, there is a very, very fine line that both by the actors and the way we think about it, that people move from individual trauma to communal trauma. And what I tried to show was how politics of memory kind of shift the science and how the science shift the politics of memory in both ways. It's a very complicated dance. And it's kind of hard to talk about also because, and I always give talks to mixed crowds of Jewish studies and Japanese studies. And I always don't know, like, for example, the stuff you brought before, like for me, of course, it's about the circles. Like for me, it's obvious, but where does I have to backtrack and say, because you're right, it's a bit complicated to talk about, but if something that I really want to emphasize is the problematization of the medicalization in both cases. That communities, you can't say about the Jewish people are traumatized, but can you? Something we need to talk about a lot more. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Sorry to interrupt you, but the audience online cannot hear the audience here.
Oh, so.
We cannot. I will try to turn it on. Hope people can hear on Zoom.
Yeah, maybe you can come. I don't know. Maybe you have a microphone? Oh, okay. I don't know. You should. Yeah, there's also questions online that. Okay, but anyway, speak speak loud.
As much as it's about medicalization of trauma experience, I also hear a lot of, how, for instance, legal institutions are playing out, and talk about the trials, talk about the concentric circles that are, defined, I guess, who get compensated. So I'm wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the way other institutions also sort of, play into the way these doctors are navigating in the whole diagnosis, diagnosis, and the emergence of the idea of survivors and all this. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so legal issues, yes, you're right, they're very important. Legal issues and how do you use the law and specifically compensation mechanism in order to deal with hurt, and how do you, and this is very both ethically and technically, it's a very difficult question, right? I mean, how do you quantify how many thousands of francs or whatever yen is a lost eye, right? So there is, for example, there's an exchange that I talk about in my book between a victim of firebombing in Nagoya and atomic bomb victims, and they say, "Why are you guys getting money? We don't get money. Like, what's different from your side?" And then atomic bomb victims say, "But we have radiation." So radiation can be quantified because of exposure, like how far you were from the bomb. So, and there's also the political issue of like, do you want to talk about firebombing? You don't want to talk about firebombing? It's very, very complicated and have this hierarchy of victims that is based on those legal definitions, but also on political decisions. In the case of firebombing victims versus veterans versus hibakusha versus survivors, who gets to get compensation? In a minute you have a compensation mechanism, you see the difference between the Holocaust victims and the hibakusha. Again, hierarchies. I really, really don't want to put those people in hierarchies, but historically, some people get more recognition than others. Think about victims of nuclear tests in the Pacific, non-white, non-European victims who got much less recognition of the same radiation. Well, Japanese aren't white, but non-developed countries, okay. We can talk about comfort women. We can talk about all those other people get less recognition. You see how the politics here really, really shape the medical, even the medical conversation, because as I said in the talk, if you don't have compensation mechanism, you don't have people looking into what kind of categories, you don't have people coming forward, you don't have testimonies, you have much, much less to work with. So all of this is really, really complicated and kind of feeds into each other. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so just want to tell everyone that we have questions from the audience who join us from Zoom. So Laura Weidenthal has a question. She said, thank you for the really interesting talk. Would it be unfair to me to say that even that the final statement was a form of speaking out, is it the largest common denominator, a question of social recognition in the forms that make sense in a given cultural and political setting? I'm curious about more context regarding Japanese mental health treatment of various kinds and forms of handling other kinds of trauma. For example, crime victim, interpersonal violence, near death in car accident, whatever. Not because these are similar to Hiroshima or Auschwitz, but to gain a better image of the idea of trauma outside of military psychiatric settings.
Okay, so I have to say that I didn't really look at, I'm a historian, so I look at the past. And up until 1995, until the earthquake in Kobe, there was just no talk on PTSD or what in Japanese called kokoro no kizu, the wounds of the heart, almost none beside very specific medical circles. Generally speaking, mental hurt in Japan, mental sickness, mental ills in Japan are seen much more severely than in the West. They're seen as clinical. For example, depression is not something you pop a pill for, to be blunt, right? It's something you're going to hospitalize for, right? On the other hand, there is much more acceptance of, I can talk about depression because there's a really good book about it by Junko Kitanaka, about cultural understanding of depression. So there is also cultural understanding of like being a little depressed is actually something good, like something you can, a state of reflection, right? In a case of trauma, there's almost no talk about it until 1995, and my book more or less ends in the 90s. I can tell that, like, generally speaking, right now the situation is much better in terms of recognition and much more similar to what happened in the West. But as far as I can tell from my understanding of the sources and talking to psychiatrists and talking to people, now there's still not as much recognition, and there's much more emphasis on carrying your suffering in silence. It's much more culturally acceptable. It's much culturally not to cause how do you say meiwaku? What would be meiwaku? Disturbance? Not to disturb other people with your pain. Not to talk about it, because it's not a culture when you talk about it beyond your family. You don't go to a stranger and talk about your problems. Generally speaking, okay, I'm generalizing here. So generally speaking, there's much less acceptance of the Western model of talking about what happened to you, of sharing, either going on public or even going beyond the close family circle. And what happened in this case, that most of this caring of mentally hurt people fall on women inside families, both wives and mothers. And there's a really great book now by Yumi Kim from Johns Hopkins that talk about the gendering of mental care that you see in modern history of Japan, and how much of it really falls on women. And in my book, I talk a little bit about social workers, female social workers, and how they deal with this. So I don't know if I answered, but it's more or less an unexplored subject right now. Other questions?
Yeah, if I may ask one.
Yeah, of course. Maybe you want to stand here because.
I'm okay, but you know, in my class, I teach Asian American history class. You know, so one thing we talk about is the silence about racism, right?
Yeah.
Of the Asian Americans had. So you know, there's the Oriental idea about you know, the Asians are silent about everything and
Yeah.
et cetera, right? So I was wondering, you know, when I saw the quote you you ended the talk with, I was, you know, wondering, you know, if there is, you know, claim about culture, right? Then how were the hibakusha, right? Those people who suffered, you know, were mobilized to talk, right? You know, what's the political context for them to mobilize to talk, and what efforts were made so
So
that they.
the political context is the anti-nuclear movement
Mhm.
and the reaction to American censorship. So up until 1952-ish, it was almost impossible to talk openly about atomic bomb experiences because of American censorship. And after the 8-bomb test in 1954, the Bikini test, there's a whole movement to both, because until then also hibakusha don't get any compensation, to both give compensation to survivors and also connect the experience of survivors with anti-nuclear movement. So in this particular case, the victim as witnesses, right, became very important. And the victims that come forward became very important. So I don't really accept the cultural explanation to silence, because here the people who do talk are the quote unquote heroes. They're victim heroes, James Orr. Right. Now, Naoko Wake have American survivors have a book on American survivors, and she talk about the silencing, but it's done from the American point of view. It's double silencing of them, both as Asian Americans and as victims of the bomb. So I would think that this emphasis on silence actually is true in the American context and much less in Japan. But the quote I brought in the end was about people who are actually going against the culture in Hiroshima itself. Right. Generally speaking, talking about hurt, as I said before, yes, being silent is something acceptable, but in context of the bomb, because it's such a public event, and the culture of hibakusha, as far as you have a culture in Hiroshima that pertain to this, really emphasize people who do come forward and talk. And the same for the Holocaust also, I would argue. Okay, thank you. Other questions, complaints, reviews? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm here.
You're a historian, but I'm wondering how was PTSD? You mentioned that it was introduced more, I guess, institutionally in the 90s or something like that in Japan.
Yeah, post 95.
Post 90s. Okay, so I'm wondering, how that happened, and if with this more sort of broader definition of this idea of diagnosis, PTSD as a diagnosis, then were there other efforts to bring in what comes with PTSD, for instance, treatment or
it's all okay. So Japanese medicine, like all other medicine across the world, is becoming more and more Americanized. So if and it's true for beyond psychology, it's almost everything. If before the war, and to an extent up to the 60s, 70s, German medicine was very important. There is a rising importance of American as medicine, and more people come here to study medicine, and so on and so on. But even with this, PTSD go into the DSM, the Diagnostic of Manual of the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. Even 1986, 1988, people use the DSM and don't use trauma. You have psychological, was a yogi hospital in Tokyo. You have I have a cart, the patient charts where people use categories in DSM but don't use PTSD. So it takes a long time, and only with the earthquake does it go in, and it doesn't go in through the American way. It goes in through the WHO manuals, and for Japanese doctors who go to work with the WHO, which is a different manual than the American ones. It's kind of complicated, basically. You have to know a lot of medical history and different models, but it's kind of coming together of the American and the WHO models in the late 1990s. There's a retranslation of the work of Lifton. There are psychiatrists that advocate for this. And then with Fukushima, again, there is widespread acceptance. But it took both the earthquake 95 and Fukushima for it to be accepted in Japan. But even this, I would argue, it's not as prevalent as it is in the US. Yeah, go ahead.
Follow-up question then, how did that sort of category, newly introduced category of PTSD, was connected to, say, the Hiroshima experience from the past? I'm just curious, how did
So as I mentioned, there is this new category of hibakutai kensha, like a bomb survivor experience, which is Japanese psychiatrists try to introduce in a way to compensate for the people who weren't acknowledged as quote unquote real hibakusha. So there's two categories of people, both people who are outside of the geographical area and also people who were affected by black rain, which is the radioactive rain that fell after the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those people only last year got recognition from the courts. So this is a way to, we talked about legal mechanism before, this is a way to kind of help the victims by way of psychiatry to what the law cannot give them. But again, the hibakusha themselves denied the category, like rejected the category. They didn't accept themselves to be PTSD victims, both because of stigmas of mental health, but also because for them it wasn't like, you can see here, we're hibakusha, that's it. We're also radiation victims, we're also real quote unquote victims, and not just PTSD victims. Still, PTSD seems like is a just category. They don't deny PTSD, but it's not enough as a category. And hierarchies of suffering are very, very hard thing to deal with, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, yeah, we are about the time. Okay, please join me to thank Dr. Zwigenberg again
Thank you.
for this talk, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, to everyone, so please continue to follow our events at Chow Center. So our next event would be on October 14th. We will have a similar talk like this. The time is the same at 4 p.m. in the same room, Craft Hall, 110. So if you haven't subscribed us, please subscribe. So we have Facebook, Instagram, as well as Twitter. I hope to see you next time. Bye.